There you go. 4-punch, 5-punch, 6-punch combination. Body shot, bang, 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 bang.
Telling him not to counterpunch.
Boom! Will Rackman get up? Reloading!
Iron. You're going through all the instructions. This is for the championship of the world. I expect a tough, clean fight. Protect yourself at all times. Any questions from the challenger?
Welcome back, fight fans. This is your host, Alden Kodash, host of the Fight City podcast. Excited to provide you guys with another episode, first featuring a recap of last night's Showtime doubleheader in Carson, California, followed by a discussion between myself and Michael Carver, the editor-in-chief of thefightcity.com. We're going to be talking then about the big takeaways from last week's Canelo Bivol fight. I know it's a little bit belated. We have some content on the site regarding the fight and how it played out, and one of the big upsets of the year in boxing, a huge shock. But we'll go into depth on what it really means for boxing and Canelo and Bivol's future going forward. But to get right back into what just happened last night, we saw a tremendous doubleheader, first featuring Jaron Boots Ennis. He knocked out Custio Clayton in the second round. Tremendous right hand over the top, puts Clayton out of there. And Clayton, 19-0, one draw, very good fighter. A lot of people were kind of hoping optimistically he would be the guy to really test Ennis. Wrong again. He was shown to be a mere mortal in the shadow of Jaron Boots Ennis from Philadelphia. Ennis, just a tremendous talent. Calls out Earl Spence after the fight, as he is his IBF mandatory. But, to be honest, I think let's just wait until the smoke clears on Earl Spence and Terrence Crawford first. I think we waited long enough. No need for anything to get in the way of that. And no doubt about it, I think Jaron Boots Ennis would be an extremely tough fight for Earl Spence, maybe almost as tough as Terrence Crawford would be. But let's wait until that fight happens with Crawford and Spence, and then let's have Ennis probably take over 147 because, given Crawford and Spence at this stage in their career and there's prospects at 154, I think it's very likely that we see Jaron Boots Ennis take over the welterweight division in the next year or two. And in the interim, there's plenty of good fights for him while he waits. I mean, he's got Conor Benn, he's got Virgil Ortiz, both undefeated fighters that it's kind of hard to see their management placing them against a guy like Ennis, who's just kind of a boogeyman at this point. But he's got very good options to pick from. David Abanesian is another one. All fights that I think he would win personally, and fights that he might be facing down the road to unify the championships once hopefully Spence and Crawford unify their championships and move on. Very, very bright future for Boots Ennis, who improves his record and stakes the claim as the IBF welterweight champion of the world. In the main event, though, we had Jermell Charlo knocking out Brian Castano in the 10th round in their rematch of their July draw last year. Very close fight last year. One controversial card that kind of was the hair in the suit, put a lot of controversy on that one in Texas. But nonetheless, the first fight was very close, and in this fight, Jermell Charlo left zero questions on the table. He was winning the fight, and he closed the show on a great fighter like Brian Castano, a guy who most people thought beat Erislandy Lar in a brilliant draw. A lot of people thought beat Jermell Charlo. Probably more thought he won than lost or got a draw against Charlo last July. Charlo just wrecks him, really. And, I had Charlo up 87-84 going into the last round. One judge had it 87-84, and the other two had it slightly wider than that. I thought it was a very close fight through the first 6 rounds, but what really impressed me with Jermell Charlo is his boxing ability from range. After round 6, he just controlled the fight with the jab and lateral movement, and really set up the counter left hook in the 10th round that put Castano down for the first time in their 2 fights. And then he hurt him again with the left hook and took him out with that left hook to the body. Riveting shot, floored him twice in the round, en route to a technical knockout in the 10th. Jermell Charlo, with the win, becomes the first 4-belt era undisputed 154-pound champion. And he's got a couple options to pick from next, although I'm not sure if he wants to really reign at 154 for a while or move up to 160, where his brother is. Jermall. Options include mandatory challengers like Tim Zhu on the WBO side and the Towering Inferno, Sebastian Fundora, I think, on the WBC side. Both Zhu and Fundora, especially after this performance, would be significant underdogs to win. Personally, I think the Fundora fight is more interesting right now, although Zhu's a very good fighter. Fundora, with his 6'6", 6'7" stature and his reach, coming off the career-defining victory over Erickson Lubin, that 10th round stoppage, I think it would be a very exciting fight. But Lubin's power was able to get Fundora in some trouble, and Lubin's a good puncher, but Jermall Charlo, I've long compared him to Julian Jackson in terms of that 154-pound knockout power. I stand by that. I know that's a very, very bold claim. Julian Jackson, one of the hardest pound-for-pound punchers of all time. Jermall Charlo, his power is just as scary, or almost just as scary. And to be honest, I think he has much better boxing skills than Julian Jackson, which I think is a less disputed point, and something that he really put on display last night against Brian Castano in a tremendous, tremendous performance. But with that performance, there's going to be a lot of questions of where he lands on the pound-for-pound list. I know some analysts already have him on their pound-for-pound list. Canelo just lost last week, so a little bit of a shake-up in the top 10 pound-for-pound. I would definitely put him in the top 10 pound-for-pound, and I almost think he might be closing in on that, close to the middle of the, top 5, the lower portion of the top 5 list with a performance like that. I mean, just think of the guy's resume. He has the one loss to Tony Harrison that he avenged by knockout in a brilliant performance. Knocked out Erickson Lubin in the first round. Knocked out Jason Rosario. Wins over Austin Trout. Obviously, this victory over Brian Castano in a brilliant fight. These are just great notches on his belt. And now he is 154-pound, 4-belt champion. Really a great fighter. And I really hope him the best. If that includes campaigning as the undisputed king at 154, or if he wants to move up to 160, where it's a relatively weak division right now, especially with a lot of 160-pounders like Golovkin and Jermall Charlo eyeing Canelo at 168. There might be a brand spanking opening at 160 to unify those belts. I can't really think of better opposition at 160 right now, besides obviously Triple G. I'm not even throw Jermall Charlo in the mix there because I don't think two brothers will ever fight each other for good reason. But Triple G would be a good fight, but he's looking at 168 pound against Canelo. I can't think of a lot of other great fights for Jermall Charlo that would trump the two fighters I named at 154, and Sebastian Fundora and Tim Zhu. Also guys like Israel Madrimov. There's some good up-and-coming talent, undefeated talent at 154, and personally, I would like to see Jermall Charlo defend his 4 belts and kind of become a dominant champion of the modern era at 154, which is a great division, really on fire right now, and they have a undisputed king, and by far, in my opinion, the best fighter in the division, Jermall Charlo. So, congratulations to him. And we will put you on a brief pause while we transition over to our discussion with Michael Carbert, and we will be discussing the big shakeup and the significance of Canelo Alvarez's stunning loss by unanimous decision to Dimitri Bivol.
Welcome back, fight fans. This is your host, Alden Kodash, for another episode of the Fight City Podcast. I'm being joined by Michael Carbert, editor-in-chief of the Fight City. How are you tonight, Michael?
I'm doing well, Alden. Very happy to be with you tonight.
Yes, we have a lot to unpack from last night's stunning upset, in my view, of Canelo Alvarez. He was defeated by unanimous decision over Dimitri Bivol, who fought the fight of his life. Virtuoso performance. Some saw it coming. Some were stunned. I'm kind of in the middle. But it's still a huge moment when a fighter who's been as dominant at the top of the sport as Canelo Alvarez, by most lights, the pound-for-pound king, is beaten, especially in a manner this convincing. 115, 113 across the board on the cards. A lot of people thought it should have been a little bit wider. We'll get into that later. What was your impression of this moment in the sport?
Well, I think there's a lot of things to take from this outcome. I think that it brings everybody back down to earth, doesn't it? About, where Canelo Alvarez stands. I mean, I don't think you could argue going into the fight that the number one pound-for-pound fighter in the sport at the moment was Canelo Alvarez. He's been very active. He unified the titles at 168. He's been very hot. And, a lot of very elevated talk about his abilities and where he stands, and about the fact that he is the number one attraction in all of boxing. He's this star figure. Mm-hmm. So that makes the outcome, the impact of last night's outcome, like, even greater. But I think in a way it's a positive thing, because it forces everybody to, like, step back and be a little more realistic, I think, about the fact that, yes, Canelo Alvarez is a tremendous fighter. He's a tremendous talent, but he's not the only one. Yeah. He's not the only one. And if he's going to test himself and push himself and go up against the other elite fighters in the sport, there's no shame in losing to Dmitry Bivol. There's no shame in losing to Gennady Golovkin, etc. I mean, I feel that many people have kind of gotten drawn into this idea that we need another figure like Floyd Mayweather in the sport of boxing to make boxing relevant. And I don't think that's true. And in fact, I think the opposite is true. I think it's better, it's healthier, if we have a sport which seems to reflect a more intense and higher level of competition at the elite level. And that, to me, is a positive takeaway from last night's result.
I definitely agree. I mean, in some ways it was almost anticlimactic to watch the best fighter pound for pound for so many years, off and on the top of the list, depending on when he was active, Floyd Mayweather, in a position that, he never was knocked off. He was never even, really close to being knocked off. I mean, there were some closer fights towards the end of his career, but he was just so dominant that, it didn't reflect as well for the healthiness of the competition of the sport. And Mayweather, he took on very, very tough challenges, don't get me wrong, but, his talent was on another level compared to the rest of the sport. And the fact that Canelo has met his match at 175 against a guy like Bivol, and would presumably be tested to similar heights against fighters like probably David Benavidez, maybe to a slightly lesser extent, or especially a guy like Arthur Beterbiev at 175, makes it more interesting. Canelo is a very exciting fighter.
Exactly.
And, he's not invincible. So, I remember going to see a lot of Floyd Mayweather fights where it was just kind of, waiting for the inevitable to happen. I mean, I know a lot of fighters, or I know a lot of people in the media that ever since Mayweather destroyed Diego Corrales in 2001, never picked against him again. And despite his great level of opposition that he was going up against, I don't even blame them, because his talent was just on that level. But, Canelo is a little more vulnerable. He's still great. He's still probably the best man at 168 and 160 by a little bit. But he was beaten at 175, and, I think there's really no shame in being beat by potentially the best man at 175. We'll get into that a little bit later about, the 175-pound picture right now with Beterbiev going up against Smith next month, which is a tremendous fight, and where the smoke will settle after they unify the division. If they do, him and Bivol. I mean, we've been waiting for 175 to clear up for a very, very long time. This is kind of a catalyst in the right direction for that, because now Bivol has seriously established himself as a major player and even a major name. I mean, he's the man that just beat the number one pound for pound fighter in the world.
Yeah, and isn't this in a way more fun and more exciting? I mean, isn't it kind of, I mean, it opens up new possibilities. It opens up we can speculate about all kinds of different matchups, both at 168 for Canelo. If he decides, I understand he wants to have the rematch. He's going to exercise his rematch clause, but still, we could speculate about, well, if that doesn't come together, what might he do instead at 168? And suddenly the matchups become, in a way, even more interesting now.
Yeah, I've never
and then we can also speculate about what Bivol is going to do, and what this win means for him going into, let's say he does take on the winner of Smith versus Beterbiev. It's suddenly a new perspective, coming off a win over Canelo, right? So this, to me, is to emphasize the point. This is a very healthy outcome for boxing, whereas I imagine there's some people out there thinking the opposite, that we were trying to make Canelo into this great superstar, into this bona fide all-time great, and that we needed that. We need that kind of figure to keep boxing relevant and healthy. I beg to differ.
And really, with the exception of Floyd Mayweather, all-time great fighters can lose. Sugar Ray Robinson, greatest fighter of all time. He lost to Jake LaMotta. He lost to Randy Turpin. He lost to Joey Maxim. Actually, when he moved up in weight, the heat in and of itself was an issue, but he found himself in some issues when he moved up in weight. These aren't unprecedented occurrences for great fighters, and I think it might encourage incidents like this will just help encourage fighters to take more risk and not be so obsessed
Absolutely.
of how Mayweather's career unfolded, and maybe try to push themselves towards riskier fights at an earlier stage. I think this is a net positive for boxing, and it helps really catalyze what's going on at 175 as well. We're so excited to hear that Beterbiev and Joe Smith. That's going to be just a brutal fight next month. I have no doubt that Beterbiev's going to come out on top, and I really hope he does, because Bivol's already dominated and shut out Joe Smith a few years back, and Beterbiev and Bivol is a tremendous fight. But lots of action there, and the exception of the.
That's got fight of the year, possibilities around it, doesn't it? Yeah.
And might be a very bloody affair. Yeah, I could go on forever about this fight, as well as most people.
Yeah, and there's no question that Beterbiev or Beterbiev, however you want to pronounce it, he has to be seen as the favorite. And so now we can really get excited, potentially, about a showdown between him and Bivol. That will be, it won't be a big money. It won't be as lucrative as, say, a fight involving Canelo, but coming from the perspective of just, pure fight fans, it'll be just as big as any other matchup in the sport. The light heavyweight division has been very exciting for a number of years, but now it's really, catching fire. And Canelo has helped to make that happen. So thank you, Canelo, for stepping up and making it clear to everybody how good a fighter Bivol is.
Yeah, and this wasn't a little splurge at 175 like he made when he fought Sergey Kovalev, just to on paper become a 4-division world champion. This isn't a splurge at cruiserweight, or the 190-pound variant of cruiserweight, like he was planning to do earlier this year against an unknown titleist, Makabu, I think his name was. This was a legitimate, one of the best, if not the best, light heavyweight in the world, Dmitry Bivol, and I, give him all the credit in the world for taking this fight. I think they knew what they were getting themselves into. And in some way, for fans of the Canelo Triple G rivalry, I think what happened last night, it's the best thing that could have happened, because, it does bring Canelo a little bit more down to earth. And if he watches the film of the fight and comes to the correct realization that no, he didn't win the fight, despite what he said after, I think he might, if he's open and puts his pride aside, he might not activate the rematch clause and go after the Triple G trilogy fight anyways, which would have been contractually made official if Canelo would have won last night. I mean, they signed to fight each other in mid-September. Had Canelo won, I mean, Triple G carried out his end of the bargain by beating Ryota Murata, and that there was nothing in the way of that fight if Canelo would have won. I think I'd much rather see this fight now that Canelo has a chip on his shoulder. He's coming off a loss, a decisive loss, and against a fighter that I really think carried out Triple G's blueprint to how to beat Canelo to a T. Bivol was pretty much everything that Triple G was in their first fight against Canelo, and parts of the second fight, just a more youthful and more energetic version than a slightly aging version of Triple G in 2017.
I agree with everything you've just said, Alden. I hope that Canelo comes to his senses and realizes that 168 is where he belongs.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of great matchups. There's a lot of opportunities for him there. And no one is going to hold it against him. No one's going to, especially since, it looks at this point like Bivol could go on to establish himself as a for a long time to come, a great champion. I mean, I hope that he rethinks what he's doing. Very hard to read this because it must be devastating. It must be very difficult for him to face up to what has happened, because everything with Canelo's career, especially the last few years, it's very carefully planned out. He knows exactly what he's doing. He's in the driver's seat, to his credit for his career, and this is a very serious setback to his plans.
Yeah, it is. Definitely is. Canelo and Triple G. Oh, I'll edit this out. I had a thought, but I lost my train of thought. What was I gonna say? Canelo and Triple G. I know what I was gonna say. Okay. A second. Brief pause. Yeah, I think if Canelo is looking at this fight objectively, and he kind of looks back in history, I'm going to steal some of the thunder from what Dan Rafael was saying in an interview after the fight, but taking an immediate rematch has historically, in stylistic nightmares like I think Canelo's up against, like Bivol, is a really bad idea. And I'm thinking of fights like Shane Mosley against Winky Wright. Stylistic night, Mosley's naturally smaller fighter gets beat by around the same margin in my view, 9 rounds to 3, 8 rounds to 4. Fights an immediate rematch, does a few things differently, but the net result is the same. Almost the same margins in the second fight. And you think of Mosley against Vernon Forrest, very similar situation. 2 fights where just not good stylistically. It's not going to detract from the legacy of Shane Mosley if he veers away from those fights and, fights fighters that are, more his size. Oscar De La Hoya, his legacy was enhanced by that victory. Fighters like Antonio Margarito, that was a huge legacy-enhancing victory. Some guys just have your number. And great fighters can lose to fighters that have their number. Eder Joffrey is one example. He lost to fighting Harada on 2 different occasions. Guy just had his number. Are we really going to, just only think of Eder Joffrey in the context of fighting Harada, a fellow great fighter who beat him twice? Not really. I mean, Bernard Hopkins lost twice to Jermaine Taylor. I don't really think Hopkins' legacy is muddled with a fighter like Jermaine Taylor, who didn't accomplish a fraction of what Hopkins did throughout his reign at middleweight and light heavyweight. So, I think Canelo should get real. I think someone needs to bring him down to earth and say, hey, maybe the rematch isn't the best fight for you. I think, you should go forward with the Golovkin fight and then just defend your titles at 168, which, like you said, I really think is his best weight division. He swept through the division, beat some very good fighters to unify, but there's more fights ahead of him at 168, most notably David Benavidez, and possibly Jermall Charlo if Charlo moved up from 160. And, we know Demetrius Andrade moved up to 168. He's looking for a piece of Canelo. So, there's more to accomplish at 168 despite having all the belts.
Absolutely. And more to accomplish at 168. And if he were to move forward that way and take on all the deserving opposition that's available to him there, he can still, despite this defeat, he can still, everybody was. What was the the tagline for this fight? It was all about legacy.
Yeah.
Losing to Bivol does not destroy his legacy. That legacy is still there. He could still move forward and establish the legacy as one of the greatest Mexican fighters of all time.
Yeah.
That's still available to him, and it doesn't matter. I'm in agreement with you all.
Yeah, he's only 31 years old. He's got a long career ahead of him if he wants to. I know there was some talk of him kind of winding things down if he were to win this fight and were to win the Triple G third fight. But, there's plenty of really good fights for him to take, and maybe, this is the start of a new chapter in Canelo Alvarez. I mean, he became a better fighter after Floyd Mayweather beat him convincingly in 2013. Maybe, there's not that much more to his career, I would think, after this fight. I mean, he was much younger when he lost to Mayweather, but, there's potentially still an upside and a new dimension to Canelo that maybe he will develop after this loss. But, yeah, so let's talk about the judges' scorecards, because there's been a lot of attention on the fact that all three judges had all four of the first 4 rounds scored for Canelo Alvarez. A lot of people have called this egregious, called this as a cry for investigation. In my view, I think they are blowing this one out of proportion. I think people should take a step back and look at the fact that the first 4 rounds, while I did score 2 of them for Bivol, were all swing rounds. Now, each judge is not going into the fight pre-filling out their scorecards. They're scoring 1 round at a time. The notion that Canelo would have held on to a draw had Bivol not have won the last round, that's ahead of when the judges were in real time scoring the first 4 rounds. They weren't handicapping Bivol intentionally. They didn't know how the fight was going to play out. They were seeing very close rounds unfold, not much to pick from between either man, and they happened to go all 4 rounds for Canelo. I'm surprised they did, but I don't think it's egregious that they did, considering that they were swing rounds. Now, I think what really solidifies the fact that it wasn't favoritism is the fact that the rounds that weren't swing, which is rounds 5 through 12, they scored 7 out of 8 of those rounds all for Bivol, and they scored identically. So they were watching the same fight as everyone else. Most spectators had the fight around, like I did, 9-3, 117, 111, which means most spectators agreed with 10 out of the 12 rounds the judges scored. There's going to be disagreements in swing rounds. I do not think it is cause to bring so much negative attention to the sport and character assassinate these decorated officials who are 3 of the best judges in the world: Tim Cheatham, Dave Moretti, especially Steve Weisfeld. Dave Moretti, for example, is the last fighter to have Canelo losing a scorecard when he fought Triple G in the first fight. He was the only judge that was kind of in line with the majority of press row in 115, 113 for Triple G. So I don't think that these judges were looking one way. It's hard for me to buy into that, especially without sitting down next to these judges and watching the fight round by round with them and hearing their explanation for their scorecards in the first 4 rounds. I think as a fan, I think and a member of the media, I think we have to be responsible in when we decide to pull the trigger on such allegations. I think being irresponsible and flippant with them just brings a lot of negative attention to the sport, and people become way too reactive. I'm kind of also speaking from my experience in the aftermath of Josh Taylor versus his last opponent, Jack Catterall. If we don't want boxing to be looked at as a corrupt sport, we need to be selective and objective, and when we question its objectivity. That's just my opinion. I know that's a lot, speaking from someone who's spent a big portion of my life in the last 5 years judging amateur fights, nearly 800 amateur fights judged at this point. It definitely pains me to see this kind of anti-officiating sentiment in the wake of, for the most part, I think a pretty good job scoring last night's fight.
Well, I can't argue with any of that, Alden, and I am very happy to take the opportunity to point out to everyone how you are an active referee and judge of amateur boxing, and so you know what you're talking about. And I think the only thing to add to that is that it's symptomatic, isn't it? I mean, of what has gone before, right? So if the judges' cards are not as bad as many are making them out to be, the reaction to them is not so much the reaction to those cards, right? It's more a reaction to other fights in years past and other outcomes, other decisions, other scorecards. Most notably, of course, the decisions in the two fights with Gennady Golovkin.
Especially, I think one egregious one was, obviously, nobody can argue that the Adelaide Bird 118-110 card is way out of whack. People don't remark on the fact that Adelaide Bird was sat down by the Nevada State Athletic Commission after that for an amount of time I'm not aware of, but I know that she was. I mean, I understand the sentiment that, we should have the best officials in the world doing fights, and there needs to be consequences. But, do we really live in a society that has zero margin for error, especially in a sport that's as subjective to score as boxing is? I mean, 2 rounds off cause for speculation into someone's character. I just arguably off. I mean, as I said, they were all swing rounds, and each round is scored round by round, independently. I mean, judges are trained to score rounds independent of one another. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you, Alden, but at the same time, when all the swing rounds are going one way, it fits a pattern. It fits a pattern that people have pointed out. I mean, this goes back to the Danny Jacobs fight. It's not just the Golovkin fights. I mean, there has been a pattern, and it kind of fits a overall push, for lack of a better term, to make things Rafa Garcia wrote an excellent essay on Canelo a few years back called The Rainmaker. And the term rainmaker, of course, refers to if you're a rainmaker, it means you make the money flow. And the basic premise of the article was that, things are going to go Canelo's way, and people are going to try and make things go Canelo's way because he's the rainmaker. People buy tickets to see him, and he's the cash cow. And so I don't disagree with you at all, Alden. I think your basic point is sound. But at the same time, it's not outrageous for people to see a kind of trend that's developed over a number of years. And it seems like Canelo is almost untouchable. And everyone seems to agree that last night's fight, it was not close.
No.
I mean, that's the general consensus. It was not a close fight. So,
I thought it was a clear 115, 113. Yeah, I think the 7 rounds that Bivol won were clear rounds that he won. And when you win 7 rounds of the 12 without knockdowns, that means you win the fight. Each fight is scored round by round, and judges are discouraged from conflating the story of the fight, the narrative of the general fight, with what's happening in each individual round. But yeah, the fact that all 3 judges had the first 4 rounds is, I could understand the suspicion that arises from that. At the same time, I've seen bigger outcries over scorecards that vary so much from one another, where they're so inconsistent that you wonder how judges were watching the same fight. You think about Marvin Hagler against Sugar Ray Leonard, and you got one judge scoring 115, 113 for Hagler, and he's sitting a few feet away from a judge that has it 118, 110 for Leonard. And you wonder how they're all considered the best officials in the world, and are they trained differently? Are they not interpreting the scoring criteria the same way, which has a degree of subjectivity embedded in it? In this case, it was the opposite. These judges, from a supervisor standpoint, did a really good job out of consistency. If this was in the amateurs and you go off of how judges are rated, all judges would have gotten the highest marks because they were all consistent with one another, and consistency is what increases your rating as an amateur judge. It's not easy. There's many reasons why things can be skewed, at least to which is the fact that the scoring criteria is somewhat subjective, and the other is the fixed vantage point they have around the ring. We have multiple camera angles. They have, one position that they're viewing the fight from the whole fight. I don't think there was any funny business in there. I think what it comes down to is 4 swing rounds, and that's quite a bit of swing rounds. And I disagreed with them on 2 of the 4 swing rounds. Right. Even had they disagreed, even had they give one of those 4 rounds to Bivol, there would not be anywhere near the outcry. And just think of that. 116, 112, 1 round different. The tenor of the reaction would be completely different. The thought that, Bivol needed to win the last round to avoid a draw, judges can't predict the future while they're giving the first 4 rounds to the fighter that they thought edged them. So, I mean, if they were looking to rob Canelo, they would have done it. That's just where I land on the issue.
You mean Bivol? Bivol.
Excuse me, you're right. If they were looking to rob Bivol, they would have found another round to give to Canelo besides the first 4. And they would have had it draw, they would have had it for Canelo. They didn't do that. There's no change in the result. They got the non-swing rounds right in its entirety, 100%. I think I understand the suspicion. The character assassination, I think, is extreme and over the top. And I think it reflects a lot of negative attention, or it provides a lot of negative attention to the sport that, I think judging has improved as a result of some of the egregious scorecards that we've seen over the last several years. But of course, it's commission by commission because we don't have a federal oversight like some other sports do. And different commissions are going to take different actions. So, a lot to unpack. I think the judges got the right outcome, And I'm glad they did, because the 115-113 did get me very nervous because Bivol worked so hard to get the victory last night. So now that Canelo has suffered his first loss in nearly 10 years, decisive loss to Dimitri Bivol, the inevitable question, given how much stake boxing fans had in his pound-for-pound number one status, is where does he go from here on the pound-for-pound list? I mean, he's amongst very, very good company near the top with Usyk, Spence, Inoue, obviously Terence Crawford. Canelo was number one on most lists. It's kind of hard to maintain that coming off a loss this decisive. So where do you think he stands now?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, isn't it? Because, roughly 36 hours ago, everybody, I mean, with very few exceptions, had Canelo Alvarez at the very top, number one, pound for pound. He earned it. He's been very active, unified the different title belts at 168. And in addition to that, he's arguably the number one star in the sport. So it's really interesting to even if you don't believe or put much stock in pound for pound lists, it's still interesting to contemplate this question, because the real question is, did we overrate him? Have we put Canelo on a pedestal because we felt it was necessary to do so, and overestimate his achievements? And it's an intriguing question. I tend to think that it's a bit of both. I mean, I think that he deserved a lot of the accolades that came his way, although I would argue that Alexander Usyk is actually the fighter of the year for 2021, not Canelo. But there's no arguing with the fact that in so many ways Canelo is number one. Did we overrate him? I think it's more the fault lies in the expectations that whoever is the mythical number one pound for pound fighter should be in some ways kind of untouchable, invincible. And
it comes back.
Go ahead. Yeah.
I was going to say that goes back to the legacy Mayweather days where the number one pound for pound was kind of etched in stone, kind of unbeatable, like Mayweather was for his reign at the top of the list. But in this case, we have a much more exciting generation that we discussed earlier. That we have 5 fighters that some of them can fight each other, like Bud Crawford and Earl Spence, that can easily play musical chairs with the number one pound for pound spot. I'd much rather be a part of that sport than the top heavy nature of the pound for pound list in around 2010 to 2015, where Mayweather, kind of ruled on the very top with some opposition from Pacquiao, who he beat pretty convincingly in 2015. I kind of like where we stand now. I'm with you.
Yeah. And meanwhile, I mean, if last night's fight means that we put a little more focus and a little more emphasis on guys like Terence Crawford, I mean, that's all for the good too, isn't it?
What about if it makes the Crawford versus Spence fight for the vacant number one pound for pound? Any narrative that gets those two fighters in the ring works for me.
Absolutely. Yeah, it kind of opens up some space, doesn't it? And it opens up some attention to looking at those other fighters, and that's a healthy thing. That's a positive thing. So it's less about everybody being disappointed with Canelo, and more about, hey, we've got a lot of good elite level fighters in the sport. I mean, and a number of them I think are underrated. I mean, you look at the pound for pound list, and where's Lomachenko? He's way down. I think the loss to Teofimo Lopez has caused us to, his stock just plummeted. I mean, is that really deserved? I mean, I just use that as an example of how one defeat should not totally undermine our perspective and our judgment of a fighter. And the same should apply here with Canelo. I mean, there's no shame in losing to Dmitry Bivol, and losses, as you noted earlier. All-time great fighters lose fights to other excellent fighters. And that's part of what makes boxing so exciting and so interesting. Why would we want to have it any other way?
I'm with you 100%. I think the loss that Canelo faced last night, he lost a fight that he didn't look bad in. He just lost to the better fighter that night, kind of butted the star of Dmitry Bivol into bigger and better things at 168 pounds. And I'm excited for the future.